Alright, in today's video I'm going to be installing some axle sliders on the front and rear axles of AJ's GROM. They are Dark Knight Street brand. Got them off of eBay. They were $145 from Thailand. They actually only took about a week to be delivered, which is pretty good for something from Thailand. But they actually look like really good quality. I'll give you guys a close-up shot of them before I start the install, but yeah, that's what today's video is going to be. This is everything that came with them. It only comes with one axle because you take the rear axle and move it to the front. The stock rear axle is longer than the front stock axle, so in order to accommodate the extra length you need to install these, you just move the rear axle to the front. You use their replacement axle on the rear, which is longer than the stock one. So these are all the tools that I used. Tape measure to measure the slack in the chain when we go to adjust that. A screwdriver to put through the hole and just kind of help tighten everything. 10 and a 12 millimeter wrench for the chain adjuster. I have a 19 millimeter wrench for the axle nut. I have another 19 millimeter socket and a 1/2 inch breaker bar. And then I just have a couple ratchets for the 14 millimeter and 8 millimeter sockets. The 8 millimeter will be used on the new axle, and the 14 is the other side of the stock axles. Alright, so on the bolt head side, it is a 14 millimeter. On the nut side, it's a 19, and we'll go ahead and break that loose. There's the nut, and then there's one washer. Alright, so we're going to go ahead and loosen up the chain adjusters here. It's just got 2 jam nuts. The smaller one is a 10 millimeter, and the larger one is a 12. We're going to do the same thing to this side. Alright, so now we're going to pull the axle out. It's nice to have a little rubber hammer just to kind of break it loose. Alright, so I have mine just high enough off the ground to where it just barely dropped out of there. If you had it higher in the air, like this could have fallen out. Nothing to worry about. Just kind of pop it back in there. Just pretty much the wheel spacer to make sure everything's spaced correctly in there. I watched one video where they didn't put any grease or anything on the axle. This one is very greasy. I don't know if that's from the factory or not, but I definitely don't think it's going to hurt anything to put some grease on it. So I'd rather be safe than sorry. So we're just going to lube our shaft before we put it in. So this is AC Delco or GM brand lubricant, so that'll probably be the weak point of this entire bike. Sorry if there's any kids watching. You may want to have them turn away. This is strictly business, but it could be taken other ways. So getting everything lined back up is kind of a pain. Alright, so it won't go in. I give up. That's the end of the video. Thank you guys. No, I'm just kidding. But it is being a pain in my ass. Alright, so we finally penetrated. It did take a while. So there's that. Axle is all the way through, sticking out on both sides. And then we can start putting our pegs on. Take the end that has the hole through it. Take that out. Slide that on your peg. You have the nuts that came with the kit. Those are also 19 millimeter. Alright, you only want to put one nut on at a time so that you can use an 8 millimeter to hold the axle from spinning while you tighten the other nut. You obviously can't just keep tightening this, you know, thinking it's going to get tight until you get the nut on the other side, because otherwise you're just going to keep spinning all the way until it bottoms out at the end of the thread. So we have to get the other nut on first, and then we'll tighten each of them up a little at a time so that they stay even. And again, use your 8 mil on the other side to keep it from spinning. Alright, we got it a little too tight. We don't want to do that yet because we still have to adjust the chain. You don't want a lot of play in it when you adjust the chain, but just enough to where you can adjust it back and forth. Alright, so now we can adjust the chain. Really, you're just going to be adjusting the larger nut. You're going to tighten it, and tightening it is going to pull the axle back and therefore tighten the chain. But you just don't want to pay attention to the chain slack. You also want to pay attention to having the wheel straight. How you make sure that you have the axle straight is you want this gap to be the same on both sides. So we'll start by adjusting each side a little at a time. So the spec on free play for this is about 30 millimeters, like 30 to 40, which is about 1 3/8. Hold the tape measure up, pull the chain up to the most slack it has, let it down. You can see that we're above 1 3/8, so it needs tightened up a little more. Alright, so that looks about right. Once you have the chain adjusted to where it needs to be, you can now tighten the nuts up on the axle. After that, you can tighten the jam nuts up. Now that all that is tight, you can screw on the pegs. You can use a screwdriver, just snug it up. It doesn't have to be crazy tight. These end caps are plastic, so be careful not to get too crazy with them or they'll probably strip out. Alright, so that is the back axle sliders installed. We'll move on to the front ones. Same thing as the rear. The nut is a 19 millimeter, and then the bolt side is a 14 millimeter. I was like, am I gonna be lucky enough that that sits there? No. Alright, so when that dropped down, the wheel spacers fell out of each side. Again, not a big deal. Just pop them right back in where they came out from. Alright, so like I said, this is the front axle. We're not using it. We're using the one that was originally in the rear. As you can see, quite a bit longer to accommodate the pegs. I'm gonna clean this one up since it has all that grease and dirt and sand from AJ thinking that his Grom is a dirt bike.
It is.
Alright, so I'm going to put some grease on this axle as well.
Let's make love all night long until all our strength is gone.
Alright, so one thing that's going to be different on the front rather than the rear is since this one is still the bolt head style axle, we'll have to actually slide this on first before we penetrate. Looks like we still have a little bit of a gap before there's actually thread, so if I try to thread that nut on, it probably won't tighten up to that because it'll stop at the thread, so I am going to use the washer on this end. One thing to look out for, when you drop the wheel, the rotor can come out of the brake pads from in between the brake pads. Just make sure you actually put the rotor back in between the pads. It's definitely a big safety issue. Alright, so here they are installed. I'm just gonna put like way too much footage of that in there. Well, should I slow-mo it and play that song, It's Mega Love, when I do that? Alright, I probably will. Since you told me to, I will.